Hello everyone. Welcome to the only one interview series with Karan. Karan is founder and CEO at Beast, where he has helped leading organizations use behavioral insights to solve complex challenges. Karan holds an MSc in behavioral economics from the University of Warwick and is passionate about democratizing science and creating behavioral change products. His interest lies in strategic thinking, product design, big data, and finance. Welcome, Karan. Thank you so much for your valuable time. And we'll be talking about how we can bring behavioral changes to nudge people towards more environmentally friendly behavior.
Great. Perfect. Thanks so much, Deeksha, for the introduction. And yeah, happy to be here and speak with you.
Yeah, thank you, Karan. Karan, starting with the very first question. It's generally presumed that to bring change in any form, we can make effective use of laws and regulations. Why do you think that behavioral change is important? Like, how does it add to the toolkit of the governance?
Yeah, great. Yeah, perfect. Really good question. And I think it'll set the tone of, our discussion also moving ahead. Laws, regulations, taxes, subsidies, these are your typical tools, right, of public policy. And at the end of the day, they also want to change behavior, right? So behavioral change is really at the core of public policy. The point of any intervention is to make people do something that's in their welfare or to do something differently, right? That actually helps them. Behavior change is at its core, and some of these are the traditional tools. But they are based on a particular understanding of human behavior and human choices. In particular, this is who we call Homo economicus. So this is someone who we read about in our textbooks, is a very rational person, right? Trades off cost and benefit, analyzes information, makes, rational predictions about the future of the world, is very selfish, can handle his or her emotions. So this is really the person, who we study as a public policy agent, right? Or a citizen. And these traditional tools are aimed at changing this person's behavior. So for example, if you put a tax on cigarettes, then, this person should optimize, the cost on his own income, say, for example, weight off versus the benefit, of smoking, right? And that he feels, for example, right? And maybe reduce consumption if the cost is high enough. Or if you just tell people, about the benefits of health insurance, right, in terms of information provision and how markets work in terms of regulation, you can assume that, okay, people are going to buy it, right? Because they'll be rationally be able to see the impact it would have on them. So these are, your traditional tools, and they're based on this assumption of behavior that people are rational. But, behavioral science or behavioral economics over the last, 20 years has shown us that this assumption of rationality is actually false. So, people actually make a lot of errors in decision making. So, they make decisions based on shortcuts like heuristics. They lead to errors, right? People actually care about others. Emotions has a role to play in our decision making, right? And so there are these diverse, influences that actually drive our behavior away from this rational perspective, which is why we need more tools, right? And these tools can be a lot cheaper. They can also sometimes be more effective than traditional laws and regulation. And sometimes the traditional tools can also backfire. So just to give you an example, there was a very famous study, I think, done in the US where, people wanted to motivate late coming parents in school at a daycare to come on time. And the researchers actually implemented a fine, right? But what happened was that the late coming parents increased because, the parents saw that as an added service rather than as a
They could pay
cost.
the fine.
And
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, in a situation like this, you need some other tools. And, if you know that, people make, for example, people are emotional, right? People care about others, then you can use some of those insights to design what are known as nudges and choice architecture. So, for example, if you tell those parents that, you are an outlier, majority of parents come on time, then you make this person feel, like they don't fit in, right? And people like to fit into the crowd. So this gives you an alternative tool to change behavior. Behavioral change policy in terms of nudges and choice architecture is built on leveraging some of these other influences on behavior, which are not very, sort of rationality driven, and they're very cost effective. So it's in terms of the right messaging, framing, don't have a large monetary cost, and they can actually guide and change behavior for the better. So So yeah, so just that would be my answer for that. So because people are not rational, right? You need other approaches to change behavior, and that's rooted on psychology and behavioral science. Yeah.
That's amazing, Karan. That's amazing. That's so like it's a beautiful you've given such an insight into how the behavior works. And talking about the approaches and tools, we have like in behavioral economics studied about the default option story. So can
Hmm.
you share any example or story where this kind of nudge has been used to promote environmentally friendly behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there was actually one natural experiment. So, there are a lot of times where defaults are added, say, for example, in terms of smart meters and things like that. But I think one of the most interesting one was a natural experiment. This happened in southern Germany around 1999, where, the energy suppliers, the default was changed into a green supplier. So essentially, someone who was better in terms of, the carbon impact and was a green energy source. And so this small, town or area in southern Germany made the default energy supplier for people's homes the green one, right? But they were free to choose, right? So they were free to choose another supplier who was not green, but the energy cost would be 8% cheaper. So there was a cheaper option that you could switch to, and that was non-green. And there was also another option that was green, but it was more expensive. So that was around 20-25% more expensive. And what they realized was that 94% of the people in the area actually stuck with the green energy source, even though there was a cheaper option available. And the reason why people stick with defaults is because we're lazy, right? If we have something and we own it, we value it a lot more. We get loss averse. We don't like to give away things. So a lot of people stuck with that default route, and around 94% of people. Now, why this natural experiment is interesting is because in the rest of Germany, there was only less than 1% of people who actually actively switched to a green supplier. But when that same thing was made into a default, then 94% of people actually adopted it or stuck with it. So this was a very powerful example, which I would like to share. One of the ones that's really remained with me in terms of how default option can create change at a very large scale, right? Yeah.
Do you think like something like this is applicable to India as well? Will it work in India?
So, definitely it could. I feel, a lot of these insights like loss aversion, people like to go with the flow. A lot of these have been replicated in, various cultures. So, there's a lot of, yeah, standardization in terms of some of these insights. So there's evidence now, even in India, about how these can be used and people actually show these behaviors. So, definitely can be done. The default is already set, right? But in certain areas where perhaps there's a new supplier and things like that for manufacturing, for example, those kind of things, this kind of a default change can definitely work. And if you don't want to do it at such a large scale, then it can be done in certain electronic compliances, right? Which by default work at a particular energy level, fridges and things like that. So yeah.
Thank you, Karan. Karan, okay, just another question. Like, do you believe in climate change?
Do I believe in climate change?
Climate change, yeah. The
Climate
concept
change?
of climate
Yeah,
change.
I think there's nothing to believe anymore. I think the word believe actually makes it feel like it's it's like someone has made it up, right? So I think it's a
Yeah.
fact now. So
Is it? So you
yeah,
feel
I
it's a fact?
absolutely do. If you look at the evidence, then yeah, I mean, it exists irrespective of whether I believe. But
You
yeah, I
believe
do
in it.
believe, of course, that it's a real thing, and we experience it in small ways. I mean, living in Gurgaon and Delhi, I mean,
You
the
can
climate
experience it
is
every
getting,
day.
yeah, right, exactly, right. So so it's getting hotter. I don't know if it's directly attributable. Um, Not sure if it's directly attributable, but yeah, in small ways and even in large ways in terms of the evidence, related to the impact on, life in the colder
Next
regions. So yeah, I definitely do
question
believe.
is related to climate change only, which is like India has announced that they want to reach net zero emissions by 2070. That they don't want like it has to be zero emissions by 2070. So can you suggest some nudges that we can start now to reach that level by 2070?
Yeah. So, this is a very complex thing, right? Because, there are a lot of behavioral changes that are required at the level of the individual, at the level of organizations, right? At the level of even the policymakers, for example, in terms of, how motivated they remain to actually achieve that goal. I mean, we can see a lot of these goals are not met, right? I think the latest Paris, the climate sort of event that had happened, they realized that a lot of the countries were way off track. So, there are like interventions required at all of these stages. But there's a very nice framework called the COM-B framework. So it talks about how, to create any kind of change, you need to think about capability, opportunity, and motivation, right? And I think in terms of carbon emission, it's, buildings, right? And meat, right? And also our choices in terms of travel. So electric cars versus, flights, or, electric trains versus flights, and, your normal carbon using emitting, vehicles. So these are, really sort of the core, factors that lead to it. So yeah, so in terms of, looking at it from the COM-B perspective, generally, if I talk about it, a lot of nudges can be thought about in terms of, capability, whether or not people can make this change. So how easy do we make it? How cheap do we make it? Right. And these are some of the things that impact capability. How do we upskill people to actually, think about the future costs, and they can make those assessments for themselves. Opportunity, again, so at the time of purchase, right, what kind of options are available, how free, is it to pick something better. Investing in green bonds, right, and investing in companies also that are green, and working towards this goal, how accessible that is to everybody. And lastly, motivation. And here's when we talk about some of the other nudges, like intrinsic motivation, telling people about the impact on the environment, designing interesting perks and rewards, right? So letting electric vehicles cut in line, right, or having reserved parking for electric vehicles, stuff like that, which can act as motivators. So I think this is a really nice framework, and maybe building things around these in a very formal way can, lead us in that direction. Yeah, from a behavioral perspective.
Okay, just very small last question. Now that you've talked about electric vehicles, anything that you would suggest to nudge people towards using electric vehicles apart from the free parking space you've talked about?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, there's some very innovative things that can be done. You can make electric vehicles cheaper, right? And that you would assume people would buy. But, the way we portray that information is actually very important. So, not just telling the person about the fact that it's cheaper than another car, but, also in terms of how much they save throughout their life, how much they save in terms of the impact, on the environment. Very, simple visuals. So some of these, very interesting digital experiments have been run about telling people about the savings, right, and creating this fear of missing out. That's one. Second, like I spoke about perks and rewards, a lot of the motivation, or the intervention areas are very monetary. But a lot of non-monetary rewards can be thought about, like getting letting people who own electric vehicles be toll free, right, across the
Yeah.
country. Reserving parking, right. Very interestingly, I think in Norway, there's a very, I think it's Norway, one of the European countries, where every time you go past a toll as well, it gives you like a congratulatory note, if you're driving electric vehicles. So giving people positive feedback, helping them feel better about themselves regarding that purchase. So yeah, so some of these non-monetary rewards, I think, can go a long way, because people value time, convenience, right,
Yes.
stuff like that. And lastly, also our culture. So a lot of behavioral science is telling us about how our purchase decisions are driven by evolutionary, psychology and culture. For example, people may perceive, a recent paper found that people perceive pro-environmental behaviors as feminine, and so men, don't want to take those actions, right? And so in terms of, creating this perception change about electric vehicles, about the people who own them, and about how they can also act as a signal for status, right? I think can also go a long way in terms of, creating this adoption at a large scale. So thinking about that cultural perspective and positive advertising, and moving in that direction.
Thank you, Karan. Thank you so much for your time and wonderful insights. And we look forward to like more sessions like these. and we'll be talking on different topics in the upcoming sessions. Thank you so much, Karan. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much, Deeksha.